In the next couple of videos, I'll be drawing out the blood supply to the limbs, but I'm also going to be trying out something a little different. Because, much like a Hollywood remake of a classic cartoon, I'm going 3D. My hope is that by drawing out the anatomy in 3 dimensions, it will help you better understand the relations and courses of these vessels. Now I'm aware this makes it a little harder to draw along with me, but if you check the description, you'll find a link to the finished sculpture. I'd recommend loading this up and exploring the model as I draw it out. Anyway, with that covered, let's head into the matrix and review the major vessels of the lower limb. So here we can see the bones of the lower limb, starting with the lumbar vertebra and heading down. I'll start by drawing the abdominal aorta. This comes down and stops at L4, then divides into left and right common iliac arteries. These common iliacs then bifurcate again. The internal iliac branch heads medially and primarily supplies structures in the pelvis. Meanwhile, the external iliac heads laterally out of the pelvis to supply most of the blood to the lower limb. Now I said it supplies most of the blood to the lower limb because there are some areas that will be supplied by branches of the internal iliac. For example, 2 small arteries leave the pelvis and head posteriorly to supply muscles and skin in the gluteal region. These are found running on either side of piriformis. So above it we'll have the superior gluteal artery, and below it the inferior gluteal artery. Another branch of the internal iliac heads anteriorly through an opening in the front of the pelvis and supplies the medial aspect of the thigh. This opening is known as the obturator foramen, and so the vessel is the obturator artery. But what about the external iliac? Well, this continues into the thigh by running under a structure known as the inguinal ligament. As it passes under the ligament, it changes its name to become the femoral artery. This enters the thigh and runs nearly the entire length of the anterior compartment. Proximally, it gives off a branch that heads posteriorly. This is the deep artery of the thigh. Now, if someone's deep, they read poetry and quote philosophers, you might describe them as being profound, and another name for this deep artery of the femur is the profunda femoris. 3 perforating branches leave profunda femoris, wrapping around the posterior thigh and supplying the hamstrings. It also gives off circumflex vessels that wrap around the shaft of the femur and send small retinacular vessels to supply the head. Let's head back to the femoral artery. We saw how this travels down the anterior thigh, but where does it go next? Well, it passes through a space in adductor magnus known as the adductor hiatus. Once it pops through this gap, it travels behind the knee joint of the popliteal artery. Coming off the popliteal artery are several small genicular vessels. These form an arterial network around the knee, known as an anastomosis. Now, this genicular anastomosis is much less obvious in real life, but can play a major role in blood supply to the leg. If we get an obstruction in the popliteal artery, these genicular vessels provide an alternative route for blood to reach the leg. This can happen surprisingly often. Because the popliteal artery passes just behind the knee, flexing the joint can bend the artery and restrict blood flow through it, a bit like putting a kink in a hose pipe. Once it gets past the joint, the popliteal bifurcates into the major vessels of the lower limb. The posterior tibial artery supplies structure in the back of the leg, travelling deep to the calf muscles before wrapping under the medial malleolus and entering the sole of the foot. The other branch of the popliteal supplied muscles in the anterior leg. To reach this compartment, it had to pass through a gap here at the proximal end of the interosseous membrane. So it travelled through this space, down the anterior leg, and onto the upper surface at the foot. This leaves us with a posterior tibial artery behind the tibia and an anterior tibial artery in front. Now as this anterior artery crosses the ankle joint, it changes its name. It moved from the leg to the dorsum of the foot, so we call it the dorsalis pedis artery. The final branch comes off the posterior tibial and heads down the lateral aspect of the leg. Often it stops before reaching the ankle, but occasionally can reach the lateral malleolus. This artery runs next to the fibula bone, so we call it the fibular artery. The major arteries of the leg all originate within a small area. Clinicians often describe this area as the popliteal artery trifurcating, i.e. splitting into three. However, technically we have two bifurcations. The popliteal splits into tibial arteries first, and then the fibular artery starts just below. Now we've got the major arteries of the lower limb, the last thing to look at are their pulse points. Where can you palpate these arteries to assess their blood flow? The first pulse you can feel is the femoral. This can be palpated just inferior to the inguinal ligament and is found at the mid-inguinal point, halfway between the aphis and the pubic symphysis. Next we have the popliteal pulse in the back of the knee. Finding this artery can be difficult. It lies close to the bone and we have tough, tight fascia covering the fossa. To make it easier, I'd recommend channeling Game of Thrones and asking your patient to bend the knee. This should relax that fascia, making it easier to palpate the artery and feel the pulse. Finally, we have two pulse points in the foot and ankle. Anteriorly, the dorsalis pedis pulse can be felt between the tendons that pass to the big toe and the other digits. Meanwhile, the posterior tibial pulse can be felt behind the medial malleolus. So those are the major arteries and pulse points of the lower limb. As always, if you have any questions or problems, please just get in touch. I'd also love to hear your feedback about how you found this video. Did it help to see everything drawn out in 3 dimensions, or did it just leave you feeling nauseous, confused, and angry? Anyway, thank you for watching, take care, and I'll hopefully see you soon for the upper limb.